On May 11, 1880, agents of the Southern Pacific Railroad rode into a wheat field near Hanford, California, to evict families who had farmed the land for more than a decade. 7 men were killed in the gunfire that followed. 5 of them were settlers. The federal government prosecuted not the railroad's agents, but the surviving farmers, charging 17 of them with interfering with a United States Marshal who had come to enforce the railroad's title. No representative of the Southern Pacific was indicted. The violence at Mussel Slough belonged to something larger than a frontier skirmish that flared and faded. It marked the visible edge of a 40-year project in which one corporation captured the legislature, the courts, the regulatory apparatus, and the land title system of the largest state in the American West. The Southern Pacific did not merely influence California. For 4 decades, it governed the state. The conventional history of the Southern Pacific Railroad begins with 4 Sacramento merchants and a visionary railroad engineer named Theodore Judah, proceeds through the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit in Utah, and arrives at the Granite Mansions on Nob Hill, overlooking San Francisco Bay, as though the story were principally one of industrial triumph. That version of events is not false. It is radically incomplete. The Southern Pacific was not a transportation company that accumulated political influence as a consequence of its commercial success. It was a governing apparatus that happened to move freight. Understanding the distinction is essential to understanding what the railroad did to California and what California eventually had to do to reclaim itself. By the 1870s, the railroad had constructed a system of political control over the state that operated with the reliability of the locomotives on its trunk lines. The system's center was the Southern Pacific's legal department at its San Francisco headquarters on Fourth and Townsend Streets. From that office, the railroad's chief counsel directed what contemporaries came to call the Political Bureau. The Bureau's function was not principally legal. It managed elections. It shaped legislation. It ensured that the regulatory and judicial bodies of the state served the railroad's interests with a consistency that no elected government could have achieved on its own behalf. The arrangement had been a founding condition, not a gradual corruption. Leland Stanford, one of the 4 merchants who invested in the Central Pacific Railroad in 1861, simultaneously held the office of Governor of California. He occupied the state's highest elected position at the precise moment the railroad was securing its federal land grants and its state legislative authorizations. His brother Philip reportedly distributed $5 gold pieces to San Francisco voters during an 1863 referendum on public investment in the railroad. The voters approved the measure. The railroad's founders did not infiltrate the government of California. They were the government of California. William Franklin Herron, who held the position of chief counsel from 1893 until 1927, inherited this system and perfected its machinery. Herron held no elected office and gave few public speeches. He operated from the railroad's offices on Fourth and Townsend with the anonymity of a man who had no need for public recognition. He reportedly nominated candidates for governor. He recommended justices for the California Supreme Court and judges for the appellate bench. He maintained working relationships with leaders of both the Republican and Democratic parties in the state legislature, a practical arrangement that ensured the railroad's interests would be protected regardless of which faction held the majority in any given session. The system did not require bribery in every transaction, though bribery occurred. More often, the mechanism was structural. The railroad had financed many legislators' campaigns, provided favorable freight rates to their allies in commerce, and offered positions to their associates. The obligations were understood without ever needing to be stated aloud. The freight rate system was the instrument through which the railroad's political power translated into daily economic extraction across the state. The Southern Pacific set the rates at which California's farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers shipped their goods to market. For most of the railroad's period of dominance, there was no competing route. A wheat grower in the San Joaquin Valley who needed to move his harvest to the port at San Francisco had one option, and that was the Southern Pacific's line. The rate he paid had no basis in public authority or independent regulatory review. The railroad set it according to its own assessment of what each shipper could bear. This practice, known to the industry as value of service pricing, meant that a farmer shipping a high-value crop paid more per ton-mile than a farmer shipping a low-value one, not because the cost of service differed, but because the railroad judged his product could sustain the charge. The railroad's agents assessed each shipper's circumstances with the attentiveness of a tax collector, and the shippers had no more ability to negotiate than citizens of a country with a single government. A grower who refused to pay the established rate had one alternative, and that was to leave his wheat in a Central Valley warehouse until it rotted. For a farmer whose livelihood depended on reaching San Francisco's wharves, the alternative was no alternative at all. The state of California recognized the danger of railroad monopoly early enough to write a remedy into its 1879 Constitution. Article 12 of that document created a railroad commission and vested it with the authority to regulate freight rates and prevent discriminatory pricing. The framers intended the commission to serve as a barrier between the public and the railroad's exactions. The Southern Pacific's response to this institutional threat was a strategy of admirable directness. It elected its own railroad commissioners. The regulatory body designed to restrain the corporation instead operated at the corporation's direction. When individual commissioners occasionally attempted to exercise independent judgment, the railroad's lawyers obtained court rulings that narrowed the commission's jurisdiction to the point of functional irrelevance. Governor Hiram Johnson, who would eventually dismantle this arrangement 3 decades later, described the result in his 1911 inaugural address to the legislature assembled in the state capitol at Sacramento. "The demand has been answered by the corporation by the simple expedient of taking over the government of the state," Johnson told the chamber, "and instead of regulation of the railroad has regulated the state." The judicial system offered no greater independence. The railroad maintained careful relationships with judges at both the federal and state levels, and its chief counsel's office tracked judicial appointments with the same discipline it brought to legislative races. The arrangement was circular and self-reinforcing. The railroad financed campaigns for legislators who confirmed the governor's judicial appointments. The governor owed his nomination, in significant measure, to the same railroad. The judges who received their positions through this chain of obligation then heard cases involving the railroad's freight rates, land titles, and tax disputes in courtrooms across California. A shipper or settler who believed the railroad's conduct was unjust could appeal to the Railroad Commission, which the railroad controlled, or to the courts, where the railroad's influence ran deep. The circle left no institutional exit. Frank Norris, who spent months in the San Joaquin Valley researching the railroad's operations for the novel he would publish in 1901 as The Octopus, gave one of his farmer characters a speech that captured the settlers' understanding of their predicament with a precision the historical record confirms. "They own us, these taskmasters of ours," the character declared in the pages of Norris's novel. "They own our homes, they own our legislatures. We are told we can defeat them by the ballot box. They own the ballot box. We are told that we must look to the courts for redress. They own the courts." The historian Richard White, whose book Railroaded examined the transcontinental railroads with unsentimental rigor from his office at Stanford University, observed that Norris captured the details of the railroad's operations accurately, but rendered the machine far more competent than it actually was. The real agents of the Southern Pacific were often bumbling, quarrelsome, and given to petulance. White compared the reality to a group of large men stumbling about in an octopus costume. The comparison is a useful corrective, but it should not be permitted to obscure the outcome. Whatever the private confusion of the men operating the Southern Pacific's political machinery, the results of their system were remarkably consistent across 4 decades of governance in California. The railroad set rates without meaningful competition. It captured the commission designed to constrain it. It influenced the judiciary that reviewed the commission's decisions. It financed the legislators who confirmed the judges. The effect on the people of California could be measured in freight bills, in land prices, and eventually in blood. The Southern Pacific received 11,588,000 acres of federal land in California, roughly 11.5% of the state's total land area. It was by far the largest private landowner in California. Its mainline tracks ran from the Oregon border to the Mexican boundary and from the Pacific coast to connections in Utah and New Mexico. Its subsidiary companies controlled the ferry and steamship lines across San Francisco Bay, the choke point through which the state's most valuable commerce passed. By 1880, no competing railroad connected the Central Valley to the Pacific coast. The railroad's political bureau maintained working relationships with members of both parties in the state legislature at Sacramento. Its chief counsel reportedly communicated the railroad's position on pending bills directly to members waiting on the assembly floor. One corporation held the land, the trunk lines, the ports, the regulatory commission, and a working influence over the legislature. The confidence that this closed system produced within the Southern Pacific's leadership would, in the spring of 1880, carry the railroad's agents into a wheat field in the San Joaquin Valley, where 5 settlers would be shot dead in a dispute over land the railroad claimed by federal title. The railroad expected the courts to vindicate its position. The courts did. The public reached a different verdict. But the machinery of state capture had not assembled itself overnight. It was constructed piece by piece, from the federal government's own gifts, and the largest of those gifts was the land itself. The federal government did not merely permit the construction of the Southern Pacific Railroad. It financed the enterprise, subsidized its growth, and then handed it the instruments of monopoly, piece by piece, across a decade of legislation that treated the public domain as a resource to be transferred to private hands in exchange for the promise of iron rails. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln in the first summer of the Civil War, offered the Central Pacific Railroad government bonds at rates ranging from $16,000 per mile of track laid across flat land to $48,000 per mile through mountain terrain. The act also granted the railroad alternate sections of public land on either side of the right-of-way in a checkerboard pattern extending 10 miles from the tracks. 2 years later, Congress doubled the grant. The Pacific Railway Act of 1864 expanded the checkerboard to 20 alternate sections per mile, a corridor 40 miles wide, delivering 12,800 acres of public land for every mile of completed track. The scale of this transfer is difficult to overstate. The railroad received its land not by purchase, but by legislative gift, and the gift was continental in its proportions. The subsidy structure itself invited manipulation. The government paid $16,000 per mile of track across flat terrain, but $48,000 per mile through mountainous country. The railroad's engineers submitted surveys that classified portions of the flat Sacramento Valley as mountainous ground, tripling the subsidy rate for stretches of track that required no more effort than laying rail across open prairie. The government accepted the surveys. The inflated payments flowed through the Central Pacific's treasury and into the pockets of the four men who controlled it. The four Sacramento merchants who controlled the Central Pacific understood that the profits from this arrangement would not come primarily from operating the railroad. They would come from building it. In 1867, the partners established a construction company called the Contract and Finance Company. The entity was technically separate from the Central Pacific Railroad, but it was owned by the same four men who controlled the railroad itself. The arrangement allowed the partners to award construction contracts to their own company at rates far exceeding the actual cost of the work. Charles Crocker's earlier construction firm had received $13,660,000 in securities and cash for work that had cost $6,610,000 to perform, a profit of more than $7 million on a single contract. Later estimates concluded that the partners extracted, by some accounts, approximately $62,600,000 in profit from the construction process through their affiliated companies. When government auditors attempted to examine the books, they discovered that Mark Hopkins, who served as the railroad's treasurer, had burned them. The construction fraud served as the foundational mechanism of everything that followed. Four merchants who had invested roughly $100,000 of their own capital accumulated a combined fortune estimated at $200 million within 2 decades. The fortune, in turn, became the foundation of the political machine described in the preceding section. The money that built the NOB Hill mansions in San Francisco, that financed the campaigns of legislators and governors, that retained the lawyers who argued the railroad's tax cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, originated in overcharges billed to the federal treasury for the construction of a railroad that Congress had subsidized in the name of national defense and postal service. In 1868, the same four partners purchased a controlling interest in the Southern Pacific Railroad, a separate corporation that had been chartered 3 years earlier to build a line from San Francisco south to San Diego and east to the state boundary. The acquisition was decisive. By merging the Central Pacific's transcontinental route with the Southern Pacific's north-south and east-west lines, the partners created a unified transportation network that covered the state of California from its northern border to its southern boundary. The two corporations remained technically separate entities, operated by the same men, sharing the same offices at Fourth and Townsend Streets in San Francisco, and serving the same commercial interests. When rival railroads attempted to enter California, the partners used their control of existing routes, their relationships in Congress, and their willingness to undercut competitors' rates temporarily to prevent any alternative line from gaining a foothold. The Texas and Pacific Railway, which Congress had chartered to build a southern transcontinental route through to San Diego, found itself blocked by the Southern Pacific's agents at every turn. Collis Huntington spent months in Washington working to ensure that no competing line would reach the California coast with its land grants intact. The consolidation was formalized under the Southern Pacific name in 1880, but the reality of unified control had existed for more than a decade before the paperwork confirmed it. The railroad's dominance did not rest on its tracks alone. San Francisco, the commercial capital of the Pacific coast, sat on a peninsula. No bridge connected it to the mainland. Every shipment of goods moving between the city and the interior of California, and every passenger traveling to or from the east, crossed San Francisco Bay by ferry or steamship. The partners recognized this bottleneck and acquired the ferry and steamship lines that served the bay. By the early 1870s, the Southern Pacific controlled the water routes as thoroughly as it controlled the rail lines. A merchant in Sacramento or Stockton who wished to sell his goods in San Francisco had no alternative to the railroad's freight cars on the landward side of the journey and the railroad's ferries on the waterward side. The monopoly was geographic, structural, and complete. Henry George, a young San Francisco journalist who would later become one of the most widely read economic thinkers of the 19th century, saw what was coming before the golden spike was driven at Promontory Summit. In October of 1868, George published an essay in the Overland Monthly titled, "What the Railroad Will Bring Us." The essay acknowledged that the railroad would bring growth, population, and commerce to California, but George argued that the benefits would not be distributed equally. The truth is that the completion of the railroad and the consequent great increase of business and population will not be a benefit to all of us, but only to a portion, he wrote. The prediction was precise. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in May of 1869, San Francisco did not experience the universal prosperity its boosters had promised. The city suffered one of the worst depressions in its history as the newly connected national market flooded California with cheaper goods manufactured in the East, undercutting local producers who had been protected by distance. The railroad's owners did not share in the suffering. Beginning in the middle of the 1870s, Stanford, Crocker, and Hopkins began constructing mansions on the summit of California Street Hill in San Francisco, a prominence that would soon be renamed Noby Hill after the nabobs who occupied it. Stanford's house at 905 California Street featured a circular entrance hall bathed in amber light from a glass dome 70 feet above the floor. Hopkins commissioned a mansion of towers, gables, and steeples at 999 California Street. Crocker built an estate so expansive that when a German undertaker named Nicholas Jung refused to sell the adjacent property to accommodate the compound, Crocker erected a 40-foot wooden fence on 3 sides of Jung's house, blocking the sunlight and the view of the bay. The spite fence became, for San Franciscans, a physical emblem of the railroad's relationship to ordinary citizens. The city looked up at the mansions and understood what Henry George had predicted. The railroad had brought prosperity. It had delivered that prosperity to 4 men. The Southern Pacific received 11,588,000 acres of federal land in California. Its construction companies billed the government, by some estimates, $62,600,000 more than the actual cost of building the railroad. Its 4 owners transformed an initial investment of approximately $100,000 into a combined fortune of roughly $200 million. Its tracks, ferries, and steamship lines carried virtually every ton of commercial freight that entered or left San Francisco Bay. Its treasurer burned the financial records that would have documented the precise scale of the overcharges. The California Hill where the owners built their mansions was renamed after them. The land the federal government had given the railroad, however, was not empty. Across the San Joaquin Valley, families had been settling on the checkerboard sections the railroad claimed as its own. The Southern Pacific had encouraged them to do so, distributing promotional pamphlets that promised the land would eventually be sold at prices between $2.50 and $5 per acre, close enough to the government's own homestead rate to seem reasonable. Hundreds of families took the railroad at its word. They moved onto the odd-numbered sections in the Mussel Slough country south of Fresno, a dry plain of rangeland that could be irrigated from the slough that connected the Kings River to Tulare Lake. They built houses and barns. They dug miles of irrigation ditches with their own labor and their own money. They planted wheat in soil that had never been cultivated. Within a few years, a district that had supported nothing but cattle was producing crops, sustaining a population of 4,000 people, and anchoring the towns of Hanford, Grangeville, and Lemoore. The settlers had transformed the railroad's vacant acreage into productive farmland, and they waited, with the confidence of people who had taken a corporation at its published word, to purchase the land at the prices the corporation had advertised. The railroad had other plans, and the law, as the settlers were about to discover, belonged to the railroad. In the middle of the 1970s, the Southern Pacific Railroad informed the settlers of the Mussel Slough country that the land they had been farming would be sold at prices ranging from $20 to $35 per acre. The settlers had moved onto the land in reliance on the railroad's own promotional pamphlets, which had advertised prices at $2.50 per acre and upwards. The phrase "and upwards" would later become the center of the dispute. The railroad argued that it had always reserved the right to price the land at its market value once the rail line was completed and the surrounding acreage had been developed. The settlers, who had read the pamphlets as a promise that the land would sell at or near the government's standard homestead rate, believed they had been deliberately misled. The brochures had further stated that any improvements the settlers made to the land would not be counted when the final price was established. The settlers had taken both assurances at face value. They had built houses and barns on the dry plain of the San Joaquin Valley. They had dug irrigation ditches from Mussel Slough to waterland that had previously supported nothing but cattle. They had planted wheat, established orchards, fenced pastures, and sunk wells. When the railroad's new prices arrived, the settlers understood immediately what had happened. The improvements they had made with their own labor and their own money had raised the market value of the land, and the railroad intended to capture that increased value in the sale price. The settlers had, in effect, been improving the railroad's property at their own expense, and the railroad now proposed to charge them for the results of their own work. Mary Chambers, one of the Mussel Slough settlers, described the experience in testimony that would later enter the public record. "Up went our land from $2.50 to $22 per acre," she said. "And why? Because we had a house, barn, orchard, alfalfa pasture, flower garden, ditches, and a well-cultivated farm. The logic was circular and complete. The railroad owned the land. The settlers improved it. The improvements raised its value. The railroad priced the land at its improved value. The settlers were asked to pay for what they had built." The families of the Mussel Slough district did what citizens of a republic are taught to do when confronted with injustice. They petitioned their government. They appealed to Congress to pass legislation fixing the price of railroad land at the government rate of $2.50 per acre, the same rate at which the adjacent even-numbered homestead sections had been distributed. A bill was introduced. It failed. The settlers argued in court that the Southern Pacific had forfeited its land grant by failing to build the railroad along the route the federal government had originally specified. The railroad had changed the course of the line, claiming that was its prerogative. The settlers contended that a different route meant a different grant, and that the land along the original route should revert to the public domain. The courts ruled otherwise. The first decisive blow fell in 1874, when the Supreme Court of the United States decided Schulenburg versus Harriman and held that the Southern Pacific's change of route did not invalidate its charter. The railroad's title to the Mussel Slough lands remained intact. The settlers had lost at the highest level of the American judicial system, but they continued to press their case in the lower courts, arguing that the specific terms of the railroad's obligation to the federal government had not been met. In 1878, the Southern Pacific filed suit against the settlers themselves. The case was heard in a courtroom where the presiding arrangements did nothing to quiet the settlers' suspicion that the courts and the railroad operated in close coordination. Leland Stanford, the former governor of California, who had held the state's highest office while the railroad's land grants were being secured, still served as president of the Southern Pacific. The settlers lost that case as well. The second decisive blow fell on the 15th of December, 1879, when Judge Lorenzo Sawyer of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued his ruling in the case that became known simply as Orton. Sawyer held that the federal government controlled the railroad land grants and that the state of California had no authority to interfere with their disposition. The ruling meant that the settlers could not look to state law for protection against the railroad's pricing. Federal law governed the land, and federal law supported the railroad's title. The door to the state courts closed. 600 settlers in the Mussel Slough district organized themselves into the Settlers' Grand League on the 12th of April, 1878. The League's members included farming families who had invested years of labor and substantial portions of their savings into land they believed they would be able to purchase at the advertised price. Many had come from established communities in the Midwest, bringing capital, equipment, and the expectation that a published promise from a corporation operating under a federal charter would be honored. The League's initial approach was nonviolent and procedural. Its members wrote petitions, hired lawyers, sent delegations to Sacramento and Washington, and lobbied legislators. When those efforts produced no relief and every legal door remained closed, the League's cohesion began to fracture. Masked riders appeared at night in the Mussel Slough country, intimidating neighbors who had purchased land from the railroad or who sided publicly with the corporation. Houses were watched. Warnings were posted on fence rails and barn doors. The anti-monopoly orator Dennis Kearney, leader of the Working Men's Party of California, traveled from San Francisco to address the settlers and delivered a speech that abandoned the League's earlier restraint entirely. The atmosphere in the Mussel Slough district had shifted from legal resistance to something that the principals on both sides recognized as dangerous. The settlers made one final appeal to the federal government. When President Rutherford B. Hayes visited San Francisco in the spring of 1880, the Settlers' League presented him a Hayes petition that summarized their position with the dignity and restraint of people who still believed their government might listen. Through sheer energy and perseverance by the investment of our means, the petition read, and relying firmly upon the rights we had acquired as American citizens and upon the pledges of the Southern Pacific Railroad Company, we converted a desert into one of the garden spots of the state. Hayes received the petition. Nothing came of it. In March of 1880, Leland Stanford himself traveled to the small town of Hanford to meet with the leaders of the Settlers' League in a final attempt at negotiation. Stanford reportedly offered to reduce the price by $5 per acre to account for the value of the irrigation ditches the settlers had constructed at their own expense. The concession would have lowered the effective price to somewhere between $15 and $30 per acre, still far above the $2.50 the settlers believed they had been promised, but low enough to suggest that the railroad recognized the settlers' grievance had some foundation. For a brief period, it appeared that a compromise might hold. But Charles Crocker, Stanford's partner, and the man who had built the 40-foot spite fence on Nob Hill, rather than tolerate a neighbor's refusal to sell, rejected the concession outright. Crocker refused to honor Stanford's offer. The negotiation collapsed, and with it the last possibility that the dispute could be resolved by agreement rather than by force. They had petitioned Congress. Congress had declined to act. They had argued their case before the federal courts. The courts had ruled for the railroad. They had appealed to the President of the United States. The President had done nothing. They had negotiated directly with the railroad's own leadership. The railroad's leadership could not agree among themselves. The Settlers' League had sent delegations to Sacramento, to Washington, and to San Francisco. At every stop, the answer had been the same. The railroad's title was valid. The railroad's prices were its own to set. The settlers could pay or leave. The odd-numbered sections of the Mussel Slough district totaled approximately 25,000 acres. The railroad had advertised the land at $2.50 per acre, a total outlay of $62,500. The railroad now demanded prices ranging from $20 to $35 per acre, a total outlay that could reach $875,000. The settlers had invested years of labor and thousands of their own dollars in irrigation works, houses, barns, and fencing. The value they had created with their hands was the value the railroad proposed to charge them. The courts that heard their appeals were staffed by judges whose careers had been shaped, in many cases, by the same political system the railroad controlled. The regulatory commission that might have intervened had long since been captured. The legislative body that might have changed the law had declined to pass the necessary bill. By the first week of May, 1880, the legal avenues were closed. The Settlers' League announced a public gathering for the 11th of May, a picnic in Hanford, where the community would hear speeches and discuss its options. The former California Supreme Court Justice David S. Terry, a sympathizer of the settlers' cause, was expected to address the crowd. On the same day, the Southern Pacific sent a United States Marshal and a railroad land appraiser into the district to begin serving eviction notices on settlers who had refused to pay the railroad's prices. The settlers did not yet know that the men were coming. The wheat was tall in the fields northwest of Hanford, and the morning of the 11th of May began with the ordinary routines of a farming community preparing for a picnic. The Settlers' Grand League had organized the gathering as a rally and a picnic, a combination of political purpose and community fellowship that was common in rural California in the 1880s. The town of Hanford, which served as the commercial center of the Mussel Slough district, was the natural gathering place. Former California Supreme Court Justice David S. Terry, a sympathizer of the settlers' cause and a man whose reputation for personal courage was well established, had been invited to address the crowd. Terry did not appear. His absence would later seem significant, though at the time it was merely a disappointment. The families who gathered in Hanford on the morning of the 11th of May, 1880, came with their children, their food baskets, and the expectation of a day spent among neighbors who shared their grievance against the Southern Pacific Railroad. While the settlers assembled, 4 men entered the Mussel Slough district on horseback. United States Marshal Alonzo Poole carried eviction papers issued by a federal court. William Clark, a land appraiser employed by the Southern Pacific, accompanied him to assess the value of properties on the odd-numbered sections the railroad intended to reclaim. 2 local men, Walter J. Crow and Mills Hart, rode with them. Crow and Hart had purchased tracts of Mussel Slough land from the railroad at the railroad's asking price. They were accompanying the marshal to take possession of the properties they had bought, land that was still occupied and farmed by settlers who had refused to pay the railroad's prices. The 4 men were heavily armed. They knew the district was hostile, and they understood that the settlers they were about to dispossess had spent years building the farms they were being ordered to leave. Word reached the picnic that railroad men were in the district, riding from farm to farm with eviction papers. A group of approximately 20 settlers left the gathering and rode out to confront them. The 2 parties met in a wheat field on the property of a settler named Henry Brewer, approximately 6 miles northwest of Hanford. The wheat stood tall around them. The railroad men were outnumbered but carried more firearms. The settlers carried some weapons, but had not ridden out expecting a battle. They had come to argue, to protest, to stand physically between the marshal and the homes they had built. What happened next has been disputed for nearly a century and a half. The sequence of events, the identity of the man who fired the first shot, and the precise movements of the participants in the wheat field have been reconstructed differently by sympathizers of the settlers, defenders of the railroad, and historians working from incomplete evidence. The accounts agree on the setting. The May sun was high over the San Joaquin Valley. The wheat surrounded the men on all sides, tall enough to obscure the lower portions of the horses. The air carried the smell of irrigated farmland, the same farmland the settlers had created from dry rangeland and the railroad now proposed to reclaim. The men faced each other at close range, close enough to see the expressions on each other's faces. What is not in dispute is the outcome. An argument began. Voices rose. The marshal's legal authority and the settler's moral claim collided in the space of a few spoken sentences. At some point in the confrontation, shooting broke out between Mills Hart, one of the two land purchasers, and a settler named Harris. Accounts differ on whether the first shots were simultaneous or sequential. Hart fell dead in the wheat. Walter Crow, a skilled marksman armed with a shotgun, then opened fire on the settlers' group. In the exchange of gunfire that followed, 5 settlers were killed. Their names were Ivor Knutson, Archibald McGregor, J.M. Harris, Daniel Kelly, and John Henderson. They died in the wheat field where they had come to defend the farms they had built on land the railroad claimed by federal title. Some of them had families waiting at the picnic in Hanford. Their wives and children learned what had happened when the surviving settlers rode back into town. Crow escaped the immediate scene. Later that same day, he was found and killed by an unknown gunman. His death brought the toll to 7. 5 settlers, 2 railroad men. The wheat field fell silent. The aftermath unfolded with a precision that confirmed every grievance the Settlers' League had articulated over the preceding 2 years. The federal government did not investigate the actions of the railroad's agents. It did not convene a hearing into the Southern Pacific's pricing practices or the circumstances that had driven a community of farming families into armed confrontation with a United States Marshal. Instead, the government indicted 17 settlers for the crime of willfully interfering with a federal marshal in the performance of his duties. 5 of the 17 were convicted. They were sentenced to 8 months in a federal jail. No representative of the Southern Pacific Railroad, no officer of the corporation, no agent who had participated in the events of the 11th of May was charged with any offense. The 5 settlers who had been shot dead in the wheat field received no official recognition of the circumstances of their deaths. The federal courts treated the matter as a case of obstruction, and the obstruction belonged entirely to the settlers. The response beyond the courtroom was different. Across California, the killings at Mussel Slough became an immediate object of public outrage that exceeded anything the land dispute had previously generated. Newspapers that had treated the conflict as a local quarrel now published accounts that framed the settlers as martyrs and the railroad as an instrument of violence, operating under the protection of federal authority. Editors in San Francisco, Sacramento, and Los Angeles devoted columns to the dead settlers and to the federal government's decision to prosecute the survivors rather than the corporation whose pricing practices had created the conditions for the confrontation. 40,000 Californians signed a petition demanding clemency for the convicted settlers, a figure that represented a substantial fraction of the state's voting population in 1880. The 5 convicted men were treated as heroes in much of the California press. They served their sentences in a federal facility and were eventually released. Some of the remaining Mussel Slough settlers paid the railroad's prices and stayed on their land, accepting the terms they had spent years resisting. Others, broken by the cost of the legal fight and the trauma of the violence, abandoned the farms they had irrigated from desert and left the district entirely. The legal battle had been lost. The railroad had won. The courts had confirmed it. The community that had called itself the Mussel Slough country would be renamed Lucerne Valley within a few years, as though the new name could overwrite what had happened in the wheat field. The physical site of the shootings would eventually be marked as California Historical Landmark No. 245, a stone monument on a quiet rural road surrounded by the agricultural land the settlers and the railroad had fought over. The monument's inscription records that a fight broke out over land titles and that 7 men lost their lives. It does not assign responsibility. The events of the 11th of May registered across a wider canvas than the San Joaquin Valley. The Mussel Slough tragedy entered the national conversation at a moment when Americans were beginning to reckon with the scale of power that railroad corporations had accumulated since the Civil War. The settlers' defeat became evidence, cited in newspaper editorials and political speeches from California to Washington, that the institutions of Republican government had been captured by private interests operating beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The 5 dead settlers became figures in an argument about what kind of country the United States had become in the 2 decades since it had subsidized the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad with public land and public money. The Mussel Slough killings would be retold in plays, in early films, and in novels for the next half-century. While the gunfight at the OK Corral near Tombstone, Arizona, which occurred a year and a half later, would eventually become more famous in popular memory, it was the Mussel Slough shootings that captured the greater share of the nation's attention at the time they occurred. Tombstone was a story of lawmen and outlaws. Mussel Slough was a story of citizens and a corporation, and the question of which the government would protect. 7 men died in a wheat field in the San Joaquin Valley. 5 of them were farmers who had irrigated a desert and planted crops on it. 2 of them had purchased the farmers' land from the corporation that held the federal title. 17 survivors were indicted by the government that had given the land to the corporation in the first place. 5 were convicted. None of the corporation's agents were charged. 40,000 citizens of California signed a petition protesting the verdict. The petition changed nothing. The corporation retained its land, its title, and its prices. The dead were buried. The convicted served their time. The Southern Pacific Railroad continued to operate the political machine described in its chief counsel's offices on Fourth and Townsend Streets in San Francisco. The machine had survived the worst violence the land dispute could produce, and it had emerged with its legal position intact and its political apparatus undamaged. But the story of Mussel Slough was about to be told again by a writer who understood that the railroad's power could be fought with language even when it could not be fought with petitions or with guns. And the story would be heard in a courtroom where the railroad's lawyers would secure a victory so profound that its consequences would outlast the railroad itself. The dead settlers of the wheat field had failed to break the machine. The novel and the court ruling that followed would define it for the century to come. The Mussel Slough dead entered the national imagination through 2 channels that operated independently of each other and produced consequences of entirely different kinds. The first was literary. The second was judicial. Together, they ensured that the Southern Pacific Railroad's 40-year monopoly would be remembered not merely as a regional grievance, but as a defining episode in the history of American corporate power. Frank Norris was 29 years old in the spring of 1899 when he conceived the project that would become his most enduring work. He had recently published McTeague, a novel of San Francisco that established his reputation as the leading American practitioner of literary naturalism, the method associated with the French novelist Émile Zola, in which human lives were shaped by forces beyond individual control. Norris planned something more ambitious. He envisioned a trilogy he called the Epic of the Wheat, 3 novels tracing the grain from its growth in California to its distribution in Chicago to its consumption in a famished country overseas. The first volume would be set in the San Joaquin Valley, and its subject would be the conflict between the wheat farmers and the railroad that owned the land beneath their crops. Norris left New York for California in April of 1899 and spent months in the San Joaquin Valley researching the Mussel Slough incident and the railroad's operations. He visited the locations where the shootings had taken place 19 years earlier. He worked on farms in the region, learning the rhythms of the wheat harvest and the economics of freight rates from the growers who still lived under the railroad's pricing structure. He returned to New York in the autumn and wrote the manuscript between January and December of 1900. The novel was published in April of 1901 under the title The Octopus. Norris called his fictional railroad the Pacific and Southwestern, but the details he assigned to it were drawn directly from the Southern Pacific's operations, and his contemporaries recognized the correspondence immediately. His central villain, a railroad agent named S. Berman, embodied every function the Southern Pacific performed in the San Joaquin Valley. Berman set the freight rates that determined whether a farmer could ship his wheat at a profit. He managed the land sales that determined whether a farmer owned the ground he cultivated. He arranged the political relationships that ensured the railroad's interests would be protected in Sacramento and in Washington. Berman was, in Norris's rendering, the corporation made flesh, and his death at the novel's climax carried the symbolic weight Norris intended. Berman fell into the hold of a grain ship and was buried alive beneath a cascade of the same wheat he had spent the novel extracting from the farmers of the valley. The novel gave the railroad its most enduring image. Norris described the locomotive as the galloping monster, the terror of steel and steam, with its single eye, cyclopean, red, shooting from horizon to horizon, the symbol of a vast power, huge, terrible, flinging the echo of its thunder over all the reaches of the valley, leaving blood and destruction in its path. The octopus of the title was the railroad itself, and the metaphor proved durable enough to outlive the corporation it described. The image had appeared before Norris adopted it. In 1882, the San Francisco satirical magazine The Wasp had published a full-page cartoon depicting the Southern Pacific as an octopus planted at the center of the state of California, its tentacles reaching outward to grip the farmers, the shippers, the legislature in Sacramento, the courts, the ports, and the land itself. The cartoon gave visual form to a grievance that had been accumulating since the 1870s, and Norris transformed the editorial illustration into a literary monument that carried the grievance to a national readership. The word octopus would be applied in the decades that followed to Standard Oil, to the trusts of the Progressive era, and to any institution whose reach exceeded the capacity of democratic governance to contain it. More than a century later, the journalist Matt Taibbi would reach for the same animal when he described Goldman Sachs as a vampire squid. The image Norris fixed to the Southern Pacific had become the default metaphor for unchecked corporate concentration in America. Norris did not live to complete his trilogy. He died on the 25th of October, 1902, in San Francisco of peritonitis following a ruptured appendix. He was 32 years old. The second volume, The Pit, was published posthumously the following year. The third volume, which he had intended to call The Wolf, was never begun. The Epic of the Wheat remained unfinished. But the Octopus had already accomplished what Norris set out to do. It made the Southern Pacific's dominance of California visible to a national audience that had previously understood the railroad's power only as an abstraction, and it did so in prose that gave the abstraction a physical shape, tentacles and all. While Norris was researching his novel in the wheat fields of the San Joaquin Valley, the legal consequences of the Southern Pacific's monopoly were producing a different kind of monument in the federal courts. In 1886, 6 years after the Mussel Slough killings, the Supreme Court of the United States heard the case of Santa Clara County vs. Southern Pacific Railroad Company. The case arose from the railroad's refusal to pay state taxes under the provisions of California's 1879 Constitution, the same Constitution whose Railroad Commission the Southern Pacific had already captured. The state had attempted to collect taxes on the fences the railroad had erected along its right-of-way, and several California counties had filed suit to recover the lost revenue. The amounts involved were small. The railroad's lawyers had compared the disputed tax to a $10 levy on a $10,000 carriage. But the Southern Pacific treated the case as an opportunity to establish a principle far more consequential than the fences. The railroad's attorneys argued that the Southern Pacific, as a corporation, was entitled to the protections of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the amendment ratified in 1868 to guarantee equal protection of the laws to all persons. The argument required the court to accept that a corporation was a person within the meaning of the amendment and that the state of California, by taxing railroad property differently from individual property, had denied the corporation equal protection. The court's opinion, written by Justice John Marshall Harlan, resolved the case on narrow technical grounds. Harlan held that the state's assessment of the fences was improper and that the tax could not be sustained. The opinion did not address the question of whether corporations were persons under the 14th Amendment, but the case would be remembered for something other than Harlan's opinion. Before the arguments began, Chief Justice Morrison Waite made a statement from the bench. "The court does not wish to hear argument on the question whether the provision in the 14th Amendment applies to these corporations," Waite said. "We are all of the opinion that it does." The statement appeared not in the court's opinion, but in the headnote, a summary prepared by the reporter of decisions, a man named J.C. Bancroft Davis. Davis was a former president of the Newburgh and New York Railway Company. His headnote, which was not the work of the court and carried no binding legal authority, recorded Waite's pre-argument remark as though it were a settled conclusion of constitutional law. The headnote became the most cited element of the Santa Clara decision. For more than a century, lawyers, courts, and legislators would treat the remark recorded by a former railroad executive as the legal foundation for the doctrine of corporate personhood. The irony was structural and complete. The 14th Amendment had been drafted and ratified to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people in the years following the Civil War. The Equal Protection Clause was the constitutional instrument through which the federal government intended to prevent the states of the former Confederacy from denying citizenship rights to black Americans. In Santa Clara County vs. Southern Pacific Railroad, that instrument was claimed by the largest private corporation in California to shield itself from state taxation. The amendment designed to protect the most vulnerable people in American society was redeployed, through a headnote written by a railroad man, to protect the most dominant corporation on the Pacific coast. The Southern Pacific Railroad entered the year 1886 with its land title confirmed by the Supreme Court, its tax obligations reduced by the Santa Clara ruling, and its political bureau operating without interruption from Fourth and Townsend Streets in San Francisco. The corporation that Norris would name the Octopus held 11.5 million acres of California land. Its chief counsel's office had shaped the appointment of governors, Supreme Court justices, and appellate judges across 3 decades. Its construction companies had extracted, by some estimates, more than $62 million in profit from the federal treasury. Its agents had participated in a confrontation that left 7 men dead in a wheat field, and no officer of the corporation had been charged. Its lawyers had secured, through a headnote written by a former railroad executive, the constitutional doctrine that a corporation was a person entitled to the protections of an amendment designed for formerly enslaved Americans. The novelist who gave the railroad its name in the national imagination was dead before his 33rd birthday. The Mussel Slough settlers were dead, imprisoned, or dispersed, but the railroad's opponents had not disappeared. They had reorganized. And in a San Francisco courtroom, a young prosecuting attorney named Hiram Johnson was building a reputation that would carry him, within a few years, to the governor's office in Sacramento, on a platform built from a single promise: to kick the Southern Pacific Railroad out of California politics. The Southern Pacific Railroad's political machine did not collapse from a single blow. It was dismantled over a decade by journalists, lawyers, and politicians who understood that the machine's power lay in its control of the electoral process, and that the machine could only be broken by changing the rules through which elections were conducted and officials were chosen. The dismantling began in the press, moved through the courts, and ended in the state legislature at Sacramento, where the reforms that the Mussel Slough settlers had demanded in 1878 were finally enacted 33 years later. The railroad's corporate structure changed before its political apparatus did. In 1901, the financier Edward Harriman acquired the Southern Pacific and merged its management with his Union Pacific Railroad, consolidating the 2 great western lines under a single financial command. Harriman's control of both railroads attracted the attention of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which launched an investigation in 1906 into the concentration of rail traffic in the West. Harriman died in 1909 before the investigation produced lasting regulatory reform, but the ICC proceedings had placed the Southern Pacific's operations under federal scrutiny for the first time in decades. The machine's political arm, however, continued to function. William Herron still ran the political bureau from Fourth and Townsend Streets in San Francisco. Legislators in Sacramento still received the railroad's instructions on pending bills. The Railroad Commission still answered to the corporation it was supposed to regulate. The first sustained attack on the political machine came from the press. William Randolph Hearst, publisher of the San Francisco Examiner, had launched editorial campaigns against the Southern Pacific's monopolistic practices throughout the 1890s. Hearst's newspapers treated the railroad as a public menace, and the coverage helped shift the terms of public discussion from the settlers' specific land grievances to the broader question of whether a private corporation should be permitted to operate a state government. The editorials contributed to an atmosphere in which opposition to the railroad became not merely respectable, but politically advantageous. In 1907, 2 California journalists, Chester Rowell of the Fresno Morning Republican and Edward Dixon of the Los Angeles Express, founded the Lincoln-Roosevelt League, an organization of progressive Republican activists dedicated to a single objective. They intended to break the Southern Pacific's control of the Republican Party in California and, through the party, its control of the state. The League never enrolled more than 100 members. Its influence was disproportionate to its size because its members occupied positions in the press, the legal profession, and the reform wing of the Republican Party that gave them access to public opinion and to the mechanisms of candidate selection. In the 1908 legislative elections, the League managed to place a small group of reform candidates in the state legislature. 2 years later, It fielded a full slate of candidates from the governorship down to local offices, and its candidate for governor was a 44-year-old San Francisco prosecuting attorney named Hiram Warren Johnson. Johnson's biography contained an irony that the literary voice of the era might have appreciated. His father, Grove Lawrence Johnson, had been a Republican congressman and a member of the California state legislature, and the elder Johnson's career had been marked by persistent accusations of election fraud and entanglement with the same political machine his son now proposed to destroy. Hiram Johnson had broken with his father's politics early in the new century and moved to San Francisco, where he built his reputation as a prosecutor willing to pursue corruption regardless of the consequences to his career or his safety. In 1906, the district attorney Francis Heney was prosecuting the city's political boss Abe Rueff and the corrupt mayor Eugene Schmitz in a case that exposed the machinery of graft connecting City Hall to the Southern Pacific's San Francisco operations. During the trial, a prospective juror named Morris Haas drew a pistol in the courtroom and shot Heney in the head. Heney survived, but the prosecution was left without a lead attorney in the middle of the most significant corruption trial in the city's history. Johnson stepped in, completed the case, and secured the conviction of Rueff. The trial demonstrated to the reformers of the Lincoln-Roosevelt League that the political machine's opponents faced risks that extended beyond electoral defeat. It also demonstrated that Johnson possessed the temperament to continue when others could not. Johnson campaigned on one promise, and he repeated it in every town and crossroads settlement in the state. He would kick the Southern Pacific Railroad out of politics. The phrase was blunt, stripped of the era's customary political euphemism, and Johnson delivered it from the back of an open automobile rather than from a railroad car. The choice of vehicle was deliberate and understood by every audience that heard him speak. Johnson refused to campaign by rail. He drove thousands of miles across California in his automobile, visiting farming communities and small towns that the Southern Pacific's lines did not reach, communities whose interests the railroad had never served and whose votes the railroad's political managers had never courted. He stopped at crossroads stores and county fairgrounds and spoke to audiences who had lived under the railroad's freight rate structure for decades and who recognized in Johnson's promise an echo of grievances their parents had carried since the 1870s. The automobile became the symbol of Johnson's campaign, as the locomotive had been the symbol of the railroad's dominance. The candidate who intended to break the machine would not ride the machine's conveyance. Johnson won the 1910 general election and swept dozens of reform legislators into office on his coattails. The Lincoln-Roosevelt League's candidates gained control of both houses of the state legislature. Johnson took office in January of 1911 and delivered the inaugural address in which he described the railroad's capture of the state in terms that left no room for diplomatic evasion. The legislature that assembled in Sacramento in 1911 was the first in 4 decades that did not answer to the Southern Pacific's political bureau. The legislative session that followed was the most consequential in California's history. Johnson and the Reform majority passed legislation establishing a railroad commission with genuine regulatory authority, the power to set rates, investigate discriminatory pricing, and enforce its decisions without deferring to the railroad's lawyers. They enacted the initiative, the referendum, and the recall, 3 instruments of direct democracy that allowed California's citizens to propose laws, reject laws, and remove elected officials without waiting for the legislature to act. They established the direct primary, which allowed voters, rather than party bosses, to select candidates for office. They provided for the direct election of United States senators by popular vote, replacing the system under which the state legislature chose senators, a system the Southern Pacific had controlled for decades. They enacted an 8-hour workday for women. They established a workers' compensation system. They passed child labor protections. They created a framework for the conservation of California's forests. The session produced 23 constitutional amendments and an extraordinary volume of statutory reform. The Railroad Commission that the Southern Pacific had captured in the 1880s was replaced by a commission with genuine independence and enforceable authority over rates. The legislature that the railroad's political bureau had directed for 40 years was populated by members who had campaigned on the promise of ending that direction. The initiative and referendum gave California's voters the ability to propose and reject laws without waiting for the legislature to act. The recall allowed them to remove any elected official, including the governor, before the end of a term. The direct primary transferred the selection of candidates from party conventions, where the railroad's influence had been decisive, to the voting public. The direct election of senators removed the mechanism through which the railroad had placed its allies in the United States Senate through legislative bargaining. Women gained the right to vote in California in 1911, a decade before the 19th Amendment extended that right nationally. Workers received an 8-hour day, a compensation system for injuries, and protections against child labor. The conservation of California's forests was placed under public authority rather than left to the discretion of the corporations that had logged them. Johnson's first act as governor carried its own symbolic weight. He paroled Chris Evans, the man who had been convicted years earlier as the Southern Pacific's most notorious train bandit. The condition of the parole was that Evans leave California. Johnson was not merely administering justice. He was signaling that the era in which the Southern Pacific defined who was a criminal and who was a citizen in California had come to an end. The reforms of 1911 represented the largest single transfer of political authority from a corporate interest to a democratic electorate in the history of any American state. The National Progressive Movement took notice. In 1912, Johnson helped found the National Progressive Party and was chosen as Theodore Roosevelt's running mate on the presidential ticket. The ticket finished second in the popular and electoral votes, the strongest performance by a third party in American history to that date. Johnson's California reforms became the model that progressive legislators in other states studied and attempted to replicate. The initiative and referendum, the direct primary, the recall, the Independent Regulatory Commission, these were instruments forged in the specific struggle against the Southern Pacific Railroad and exported to a national movement that recognized in California's experience the template for breaking corporate capture of state government. Johnson's reforms arrived 31 years after the settlers of the Mussel Slough country had petitioned Congress, appealed to President Hayes, and died in a wheat field defending land they believed was rightfully theirs. The reforms did not bring the dead back. They did not compensate the families who had been broken by the legal costs and the violence of the 1880s. But they dismantled the political machinery that had made the Mussel Slough tragedy possible, and they placed in the hands of California's citizens the democratic instruments that the settlers had lacked. The railroad's political dominion was ended, but the physical empire, the 11 million acres and the rights of way, the ferry lines and the freight corridors, persisted in forms that the progressives of 1911 never anticipated. The question that remained was what the Octopus had left behind. The Southern Pacific Railroad ceased to exist as an operating company on the 11th of September, 1996, when the Union Pacific Railroad completed its acquisition and absorbed the system that the four Sacramento merchants had begun building more than a century earlier. The locomotives were repainted. The routes were folded into Union Pacific's national network. The name Southern Pacific disappeared from the sides of freight cars and from the timetables of the American rail system. The company that had governed California for 40 years ended its corporate life as a line item on another corporation's balance sheet. But the material empire that the federal government had created with its land grants did not disappear when the railroad changed hands. The land remained. In 1986, a decade before the Union Pacific merger, the Southern Pacific's California real estate holdings had been transferred to a new entity called Catellus Development Corporation. Catellus inherited the checkerboard sections that Congress had granted in the 1860s, the same acreage that had drawn the Mussel Slough settlers onto the railroad's land, that had generated the confrontation in the wheat field, and that had provided the economic foundation for the political machine the progressives dismantled. By the 1990s, Catellus had become the largest private landowner in the state of California, holding 817,000 acres of the state's land. The company developed Mission Bay and Alameda Landing in the San Francisco Bay Area, transforming railroad land into residential and commercial property at prices that would have been unimaginable to the settlers who had been told they could buy the same acreage for $2.50. In 2005, Catellus merged into Prologis, a global industrial real estate company, for $3.6 billion. The land grants that Abraham Lincoln had signed into law during the Civil War, and that the Big Four had used to construct a monopoly over California's commerce, were still generating private revenue for shareholders on a global stock exchange in the 21st century. 140 years after the original transfer from the public domain. The most enduring institution the railroad produced outlasted both the real estate companies and the railroad itself. It was a university. Leland Stanford, who had served as president of the Central Pacific Railroad for nearly 3 decades and whose governorship had coincided with the railroad's earliest federal grants, lost his only son, Leland Stanford, Jr., to typhoid fever during a family tour of Europe in 1884. The boy was 15 years old. In their grief, Stanford and his wife Jane decided to establish a university in their son's name, endowing it with a portion of the fortune the railroad had generated. Had the boy lived, the fortune would almost certainly have passed to him, and the university would never have been built. Leland Stanford Jr. University opened in 1891 on the Stanford family's 9,000-acre Palo Alto stock farm south of San Francisco, on land that the railroad's wealth had purchased and the railroad's political connections had secured. The endowment came from the railroad. The land came from the railroad. The wealth that built the campus, hired the faculty, and established the research programs that would define the university's character for the next century originated in the construction overcharges, the land grant sales, and the freight rate monopoly that the Southern Pacific had operated across the state of California. The writer Rebecca Solnit, examining the lineage from the railroad to the modern technology industry from her vantage point in San Francisco, observed that the connection between the Southern Pacific and Silicon Valley was not a distant one. The lineage was remarkably short. Stanford University produced Sun Microsystems, Google, and Yahoo, companies that would come to exercise over the digital economy a concentration of influence that bore structural resemblance to the railroad's dominance over California's physical commerce. The 19th century monopoly that had used its control of a networked technology to dominate the governance and trade of the American West had given rise, through the university it endowed with the proceeds of that dominance, to a new generation of corporations that would use their control of a different networked technology to exercise a comparable reach over a far larger territory. The historian Richard White, working from his office on Stanford's campus, noted the resemblance between the old robber barons and the new technology billionaires with the dryness of a man who understood exactly where his salary originated. The Octopus suit in Solnit's framing had been handed down. The political instruments that Hiram Johnson created to break the Southern Pacific's hold on California continue to govern the state more than a century after their enactment. The initiative process, through which citizens can propose laws without the legislature's approval, has been used hundreds of times since 1911 on subjects ranging from property tax limitations to criminal sentencing to the legalization of marijuana. The referendum, through which citizens can reject laws the legislature has passed, remains active and has been deployed against legislation backed by interests that the railroad's political managers would have recognized. The recall, which Johnson enacted to ensure that no elected official could serve beyond the tolerance of the electorate, was used to remove Governor Gray Davis from office in 2003 and was attempted against Governor Gavin Newsom in 2021. Critics of the initiative process have argued, with some justice, that it has introduced its own distortions into California governance, that well-funded interest groups can use the initiative to bypass the deliberative process the legislature was designed to provide. The observation is fair, but the instruments were designed to solve a specific problem, and the problem they were designed to solve was the capture of a state government by a single corporation. They remain in the California Constitution as a permanent structural response to the 40 years during which the Southern Pacific Railroad operated the state as an extension of its commercial operations. The corporate personhood doctrine that emerged from the Santa Clara Headnote of 1886 has never been overturned. The principle that a corporation is a person entitled to the protections of the 14th Amendment remains embedded in American constitutional law, invoked in cases that the Southern Pacific's lawyers could not have imagined and applied to corporations whose scale dwarfs the railroad that first claimed the right. The amendment, written to protect formerly enslaved Americans, continues to shield the legal interests of the largest business entities in the country, more than a century after a former railroad company president recorded a remark from the bench and called it settled law. The Southern Pacific Railroad received 11.5 million acres of California land from the federal government. It operated the state's political system for 4 decades through a political bureau housed on Fourth and Townsend Streets in San Francisco. It set freight rates without competition and captured the regulatory commission designed to constrain it. Its agents participated in a confrontation that left 7 men dead in a wheat field near Hanford. Its lawyers secured the constitutional principle that a corporation is a person. Its construction profits endowed a university that became the incubator of the world's most valuable technology companies. Its land grants still generate private revenue in the 21st century. Its opponents built the direct democracy system that continues to govern the most populous state in the United States. Its name has been gone from the sides of freight cars for 30 years. Its consequences have not. The wheat field, 6 miles northwest of Hanford, where 5 settlers and 2 railroad men died on the 11th of May, 1880, is still farmland. The irrigation ditches the settlers dug from Mussel Slough still carry water to the fields of what is now Kings County. California Historical Landmark 245 stands on a quiet road at the edge of the property where the shooting took place. The marker records that 7 men lost their lives in a dispute over land titles. It does not record who owned the law that made the dispute inevitable, or who profited from the land after the dead were buried, or how long the consequences lasted. The wheat still grows. The octopus is gone. The shadow remains. This documentary was produced by Empire of Acres, The channel's work examines how dynasties, land fortunes, and company empires built and lost power across the American landscape. If you found this investigation worth your time, subscribe for more stories. The history does not end here.